morning. First of all, we would like to say thank you to all attendees for today's session. This is the pre-proposal conference for VITA's RFP number 2017-04, Server Storage and Data Center Services. My name is Bridget King. I will be serving as your single point of contact throughout the RFP process. The primary purpose of today's conference is to provide a general program overview and highlight key RFP instructions. The meeting is not intended to address technical questions. However, there will be an opportunity to submit such questions in writing anytime prior to November 8th. At this time, we will move into today's presentation, which will be facilitated by Tim Rickman of Integris Applied, who is a professional consultant assisting VITA with this process. Tim?
Good morning. This is Tim Rickman. Thanks, Bridget. Welcome today. We look forward to the conversation. We've allocated about an hour and a half, and we can extend a little bit longer. Although some of our prior conferences have been, narrowed to an hour, we realized that sometimes we've been a little pressed for time, and there may be more questions on this one. So we've allocated a little bit of extra time. Later in the presentation, you'll of course hear Bridget talking a little bit more, and also my colleague Alejandro, who will speak to some of the financial subjects. So I want to point out at the bottom of this list, note well that this conference is for informational purposes. We think it's very helpful to communicate verbally a lot of what's in the documents or what's behind our goals here, but always the written word applies. So if for some reason we accidentally misspeak, we'll of course try to correct that in writing. But if there's any conflict that you see between what one of us says today and what you've seen in the written communications, please let us know, but assume that the written word trumps it. Also, the conference is being recorded, and barring any technical issues, we will plan to post this on YouTube so that you can share it with your colleagues as you work on your proposals. We'll also post the attendee list of all suppliers. So as for the agenda, we're going to talk a little bit about our background, why we're here, some of our goals, both for the program and the RFP. We'll of course walk through the response format. We'll talk a little bit about the multi-sourcing service integration, particularly now that the contract has been signed for that procurement with SAIC. We'll also walk through some of the documents. For many of you that have watched this process for a while, a lot of this will be repetitive, so I apologize for that, but our history is still the same, and our goals are still the same, and a lot of the process is the same. So, we'll walk back through all of that. So as to the background, Virginia, as you all know, has been a leading state in the centralization and consolidation of its IT services, and it's done that through an agreement with Northrop Grumman, CIA. That agreement was largely successful in achieving its goals, but they were very much about centralization and consolidation, moving the Commonwealth to a heightened level of security and standardization. But of course, that agreement is expiring, and as the Commonwealth and VITA and its customers seek to move to a new model, they want to have a greater focus on the balance of agency and enterprise needs. So whereas the kind of first generation sole source outsourcing or single provider outsourcing was very much focused on the enterprise standardization and security, the future model must maintain that profile while turning the focus to the agency needs around innovation, flexibility, and that sort of thing. The contract is expiring in 2019, and VITA has exercised all of its extension options, and so we have a need to change at this point in time. The Commonwealth is well positioned to move to a new model. VITA has spent really years now planning for this. They've worked with various stakeholders and customers along the way to build a momentum for change, and the accomplishments of standardization that have occurred through the CIA position it well to move to the next generation of its model. So our next slide is an outcome of the assessment that we Integris Applied did here back in 2015. One of the things we did was interview most of the customers, I think 60 or so, customer agencies, also various leaders within the Commonwealth, as well as folks within VITA, to try and understand what are all the goals of the various parties. There's often a view that enterprise goals might conflict with agency goals, and that they're sort of opposite ends of the spectrum. But as we kind of identified the goals of the separate parties, we said, well, they don't necessarily conflict. They're not the same, but we can certainly establish a model that addresses all of them to some extent. And so the multi-sourcing approach, with identifying best-of-breed providers for individual scope of service, coordinated through the MSI, is a model that we recommended and ultimately VITA selected to address these various goals. The sourcing program was arranged in 3 waves. Wave 1 was completed back in 2016 with messaging and mainframe. Messaging awarded to Tempus Nova, the supplier of Google services, and mainframe awarded to DXC. Wave 2 covered the MSI, which has now been awarded as of August 2017 to SAIC. Managed security was also part of that, and that procurement is still underway, but on track for a signature. Wave 3 is what we're talking about now, and really it's all the remaining services. And of course, our focus today is the server, storage, and data center RFP. So these goals relate to the program itself. We've got separate goals for each individual RFP, but as an infrastructure services program, we want to make sure these things are met. So we want to maintain and improve service quality. Certainly want it to be as good or better in the future as it is today. We also want to make sure that we maintain cost competitiveness over time. So both now and in the future, that doesn't mean just getting a good deal or something today. It means making sure that we can we're repeatedly getting good market rates, that we can show that to our customers. And then finally, create a platform view of service that's highly visible and accountable. So greater transparency into the environment about consumption, cost, performance, and all that sort of thing. The next slide is a summary of the RFP goals that are in the instructions. And I say summary because I've removed some of the sub-bullets, although there's still a lot here. I'll kind of walk through it in kind of a paraphrase fashion. So first and foremost is to assume all services for server-based compute, storage facilities, et cetera, provided under the CIA. Second, to ensure the integrity of disaster recovery services. That's obviously very important. Third, mitigate risk and document the environment. So there's definitely a need, as we kind of, before we think about evolving, we want to make sure that we understand the environment, very well and get better clarity into it. So that's the purpose of that goal. We, of course, one day want to evolve to the next generation, to improve performance and, transform to new services that you might propose. We want to make sure that services are flexible, rapidly provisioned, cost-effective, elastic to meet VITA and the customer needs. We want to have better detail of the plans, assumptions, and dependencies on VITA and customers, as they think about migrating and transforming in the future. And finally, ultimately provide new data center services to meet the future needs of VITA and its customers. So next slide, we get into the response format and timing. We will, in the instructions, we use the word CD-ROMs, but you could also think USBs. So either of those is fine. But the proposal needs to be split into these 3 disks or USB drives. Disk 1 you can think of as the entire proposal, the solution-related elements of the proposal. It's really the entire proposal except for anything related to pricing, which basically the pricing is for the most part the Exhibit 4 and related documents. So then disk 2 is all the pricing and financial information. And of course, the reason we separate these things is, at least in the initial round, we like to keep the view of the pricing separate from our solution for our internal review. And then disc 3 is the entire proposal, both solution and price, with any proprietary information redacted. And that's your opportunity, and Bridget will talk about this in a minute. You know, there are certain things that you can mark as proprietary in your proposal, and you know, we'll ask that you do that in a certain form. But anything you do claim to be proprietary, we want you to remove from this disc 3, such that we don't have to go through and try and redact it ourselves if later requested in a FOIA request or something like that. So there's additional guidance regarding the submission in Section 3 of the RFP instructions. Obviously, this text here is really just a summary of what's there. You can also look at the administrative Appendix A, the table of documents, which indicates the response format for the various documents. Finally, and very important, the due date is November 16th by 4 p.m. That is a hard cutoff. Unfortunately, we can't accept anything later than 4, even 1 minute later. And we certainly want your proposals, so please make sure that you're able to get them in on time. We also cut off submitting questions a week before, and really that's just for pragmatic reasons of, you know, at some point you need to snap the line and, you know, finalize your price and that sort of thing, and we recognize that if we're still responding to questions after November 8th, then that you don't really have enough time to do that. So with that, I'll move a little bit into what is the MSI role? What does that look like? And I will encourage you, now that the SAIC contract has been signed, it's posted on VITA, VITA's website. I'll give you a link to that here in a little bit. The multi-sourcing service integrator is a role within the services environment that really should exist in any mature technology environment. It's not, you know, if we think about the current box of Northrop Grumman services, this is not something that would layer on top of it. It's really something that layers across the towers within that box. They perform coordination integration across the multiple providers with a shared accountability for service delivery, and I'll talk a little more about that on the next slide. Part of the purpose is to increase the quality and transparency of integration, and therefore ultimately service delivery. So, you know, we've got these multiple providers in place, and so in a sense it's already more transparent because we have those individual providers, but we want to make sure that we don't have any gaps or overlaps, and the MSI will help to ensure that. They create a platform for new suppliers to plug into, the various kinds of tower suppliers, so we can more easily, you know, pull suppliers in and out of the program. Of course, all suppliers in the program are required to create and stand up to OLAs and shared service levels, and the MSI drives the development of those items to a great extent. This next slide is just meant to give you a quick overview of the sort of difference between the MSI and the tower service suppliers. I'll start on the right. Of course, the tower service suppliers perform the actual work on servers. They provide servers. They fix servers, you know, that sort of thing. They provide the monitoring directly on servers. But the MSI is very much an oversight and coordination role. So they write policies, of course, with your support. They write process documentation. They provide enterprise-level tools. You know, they drive service level management, planning, and these sorts of things. But they also have a role in service delivery, in particular the service desk. So they own the level 1 service desk, and that, as we see it, you know, makes them not just a project manager or process documentation writer and checker, but it puts them right in the tent in service delivery, which opens up the opportunity for things like shared service levels and operating level agreements, because then they have a shared accountability with you for service delivery. So that's kind of the brief MSI overview. I'll move next into the contract structure, and then what are really the RFP documents, and we'll walk through a few of those in a minute. This is a view that we show to kind of describe the components of the contract. We always say that, any contract, people often refer to the three-legged stool of a contract as being, the service, the quality, and the price. Any contract should have those things. So in our agreement, the service and scope is Exhibit 2. The quality, that service levels and reporting, is in Exhibit 3. And then finance and pricing is in Exhibit 4. But, we're not buying a machine or a project. We're really buying a long-term services relationship. And so Exhibit 1 is about governance and change and sets some of the ground rules for the program. And then Exhibit 5 talks through the human resources, key personnel, personnel projection matrix, and that sort of thing. And of course, it's all held together by the Master Services Agreement. This next slide is just a view. It's not an exact representation of the RFP documents, but it's partly intended to show you how it breaks up in further detail. So this is a sample to say, imagine there's an MSI contract, a server storage contract, a managed security contract. There's certain documents that you can see that the numbering and naming, follows from what I said on the prior slide. But there are certain documents that we want to be common to all providers, and that's really important. We're creating kind of a sandbox which has a certain set of rules, and if you want to play in the sandbox, we sort of all agree to the rules. And so in general, the dark blue highlighted documents are those documents that we think of as common across the program, and with very little exception, we want to code for all suppliers. So one example of that is our definitions list, right? Every contract has a list of definitions, all the capitalized terms, but certain of those terms need to apply to all providers so that we're talking the same language. Likewise, a service management manual outline, an operating level agreement outline, the governance model, those things, should be common for all providers operating together in this ecosystem. And, having said that, though, each provider has its own specific scope of work, pricing, and service level metrics, and that sort of thing. And so the light blue documents, and of course this is just a summary, the light blue documents are those that are unique to each provider. Yep. All right. So now we'll move into some of the documents. I will start actually with what we call the RFP table of documents. So a slightly different order that's on here. And then we'll move from there into the instructions. One of the things I want to point out, and you'll see this as we get into some of the documents, particularly service levels and pricing in a few minutes. We've chosen this RFP to not release every single contract document. So for example, we've chosen not to release most of the Exhibit 1 documents. We do have a view of the governance model. We've shared it in prior RFPs, in the MSI RFP, the security RFP, so you could go back and you could look at those RFPs that have been posted in public for a year or so now to see what that is. But as we have now hired the MSI, we do expect that SIC will help us refine that model. And so we've chosen for the time being to not release documents related to that, and instead just announce that sometime later in the process with SIC's implementation, we will then, assuming you're working with us at that later stage in the process, we would then release some of those documents to you, and we would talk about how that works. Likewise, we're asking you, well, not exactly likewise, but also we've not released specific service level metrics or specific pricing units. And so we're going to ask you to actually propose back, some of those items. So we said that, let me jump into this document list. The first section is RFP, sort of administrative documents. Some of those require a response, but in general, these documents do not become part of the contract. They're to support the procurement process. And so the format for this table, you can obviously see the name of the document, what it is, and whether it's included or might be developed later. If a response is required, it will indicate, is this a template? And if it's a template, it will have instructions, and each one is a little bit unique, and so there's some instructions within that document to respond to it. And then we also indicate which CD or USB drive it would go on, whether that's 1 or 2. So of course we've got the supplier profile, where you would describe your experience. You would indicate your references in that document. Standard agreement is a set of affirmations that you confirm back that, yes, I agree to certain things in the RP. Yes, I agree to, VITA rules, and I commit that this response is everything that I expect to need to change or propose to VITA. Authorization to transact business. This allows you to indicate your state corporation commission status. Here, Appendix E is the proprietary information. This is where you would indicate any of the any parts of your proposal that you believe to be proprietary. The procurement and subcontracting plan, where you can indicate any and all subcontractors, including those which maybe have SWAM status, so small women and minority-owned businesses. And then the VPAT form, it's called the Voluntary Product Accessibility Template, but I always want to point out that that's a misnomer. It's not. It's just the title of the form. We do want you to send that back. Do not think of it as necessarily voluntary. Next, we've got sort of cut off on the screen here, but Appendix H is the key assumptions. So for those who've looked at VITA RFPs in the past, in the last year or so, we've often had an assumptions tab within the finance exhibit, but we've basically just decided to extract that, make it its own document, because it's a document that really we want to communicate with our entire team internally, about the assumptions that really affect solution or price. So that's where that is. Any pricing or solution related assumptions we're going to ask you to put there. And then finally, Appendix I is the potential due diligence requests. So, in essence, we've just decided to pull ahead the request process so that we can get a head start on gathering information. But as it says in that form, you need to be aware that that's something that would occur in a later phase of this process. The formal due diligence would be later, and only providers that have been carried forward to that stage of the process would participate in that. But we just thought it'd be a good idea to get the data gathering started, so that will help us. The next category of documents are environment overview documents. We've released one called Appendix A, and that's just a VITA program overview. And then there's a whole slew of other documents that we've decided not to post on EVA, but they are available on request. So we want to encourage you to email Bridget and ask for those documents. And so those cover things like, what's the data center environment look like in narrative and some volumes? What is our current SLA performance? We've got product roadmaps and other documents. Okay, so then we get into the what really become part of the contract documents, and here's where you'll see that some items on the list are included and other items say to be developed later, and that just means that at some stage later in the process, either sort of midstream while we're still trying to sort out your solution and price, maybe we would start to talk about the governance model, for example, or we might refine our view on service levels, or they might be at the very end based on your solution and where we are in terms of final negotiations and contract cleanup, frankly. But the first and many ways the most important document, the Master Services Agreement, that holds everything together, that is of course included, and it has what we call a table format for response. And there's just a few documents that are table as opposed to template, and there are some instructions for responding to those documents within the RFP instructions. But basically, we're saying rather than mark up the MSA in line, we're saying put your feedback within this table, which is up at the beginning of the document. There are some others that are included for reference that we don't need any particular response for, that would become part of the contract for use later. Some documents, like the Cloud Services Addendum, might be needed later based on your solution. It's just really an example of something that we might introduce later if needed. It's just got additional terms related to cloud. So then we get into the Exhibit 1 set, and here's where we get into all the kind of functional exhibits that relate to the program or to the server-specific requirements. So as I mentioned, for the most part, we've not released any Exhibit 1 documents. If you want to have a sense for what those look like, you can look at prior RFPs, but we would plan to release those later in the process, maybe further refined based on internal working with SAIC as part of their implementation. However, we did release the definitions document. We think that's pretty important and shouldn't really change much. And of course, no response is required for any of that. We see those definitions as just what they are for the program. Exhibit 2 is everything related to the services and solution, the requirements, ultimately, your response in the form of a written solution narrative, and I'll open some of these documents in a minute. Your implementation plan, implementation milestones. Also note that we've got a transition out plan that would be developed later. That document is your is sort of a working plan for how we would kind of remove your services on contract expiration or termination, but that's something we develop later, really during the implementation. Else to highlight Exhibit 3. Again, I'll open, leave some of these documents, but we have released only Exhibit 3 itself and a service level matrix. So, Exhibit 3 is the methodology that we think is core to the program. We do allow you to respond in this table, but the service level methodology that we've released is what SAIC has agreed to. It's what VITA wanted for the program, and of course, it describes shared processes. And so, we really expect all the suppliers to work with those processes. We released the service level matrix, which includes some of the metrics that the MSI has that you would also be a party to in a shared fashion. But it also has blanks for you to propose your own solution-specific metrics. And then off to the right in the template, which you'll see in a minute, you can describe how they work a little bit. And then, of course, later in the process, we would develop further descriptions of those metrics. Exhibit 4 gets into the pricing and financial provisions, of course. The pricing itself, as we'll walk through in a minute, we're asking suppliers to propose their own pricing units that theoretically might align with your proposed service level. Let's say, for example, Gold Server instance might have a certain price and would have a certain service level. We've released our current consumption volumes, so the existing resource units that we have under the CIA and what the volumes of those are. It's really kind of just a reference document. We've got a document that sort of describes our approach to resource unit definitions and allows you to propose some back. Financial responsibility matrix will be developed later. We have included a form of invoice, the base case, a list of equipment assets and software assets. The equipment assets I'll highlight is out of the CMDB, so there's a lot of detail there. And then the software assets describes what we know about our current software environment and also indicates some of the tools that the MSIs bring to the table, and that part being for your reference. Finally, into Exhibit 5, Exhibit 5 itself doesn't, we didn't release it, but it doesn't really have content. The provisions related to human resources are all up in the MSA. We've also not released a key personnel form at this stage. Of course, we'll be interested for you to propose certain individuals early in the process that you would see as maintaining throughout and ultimately maybe being committed to the service delivery. But we recognize that it may be a little bit early and it's not necessary for a huge amount of focus right in the first response, so we've not released that. But we have released the personnel projection matrix for you to indicate your staffing loads in various functions. Okay, with that, I am going to put the RFP instructions back on the screen. and I'll hand it over to Bridget to talk through some of those, and of course I'll add highlights as we go through it.
Okay, as Tim mentioned during his overview of the documents that are included, you should see a document entitled RFP Instructions, and the instructions for submittal are outlined in a great detail by the instructions document, specifically in Section 2. All the instructions are there. We certainly don't want to have to read through every instruction that's listed, but I would like to highlight a few of the instructions that are provided there for you. Section 2K talks about the proposal protocol, basically giving you an outline as to how to submit your proposal. We do ask that you provide 2 original hard copies and 3 disks. That may be CD-ROM or a USB drive, whichever suits you better. But we also go into a little more detail, telling you exactly what to include on each one of the disks that you will see there. So your first disk should be basically your overall solution that you're responding. Disk 2 should include your pricing proposal. And then, of course, the third disk should contain a redacted version of the solution that you've proposed, with everything redacted there. Section 2O contains your evaluation factors. That does outline all of the criteria that your solution will be evaluated on. So we wanted to present that up front so that you can clearly see the factors that will be involved in the evaluation. Section 2Q, we present the timetable that we are trying to adhere to, with the understanding that those dates may vary, but we'll certainly alert you if that happens. But those are the tentative dates that we've outlined thus far.
We're just, of note here, I want to highlight that on some prior RFPs, we've not projected a particular implementation date target.
Right.
But in this one, we are. We are driving to get this signed by the summer of 2018 and to actually implement by December 2018. So you know that the existing agreement runs through the end of June, but we are looking for suppliers to be able to commence their own services in December. And that's some of our goals, the initial goals of kind of taking over and running the existing environment. Mm-hmm. Of course, you could propose your own solution. We're not dictating a particular implementation plan, but we are telling you that you should plan to commence by December 2018.
Thank you, Tim. And continuing on with the instructions in Section 2R, we outline the EVA registration requirements. We do request that you register through EVA. You can submit without having registered. However, if we get to the point of making an award, you will be required to be registered, to have your registration completed through the EVA portal. So we do encourage you to go ahead and do your EVA registration if you've not already done so. And that basically entails everything that we wanted to highlight as far as the instructions. They are there. As you go throughout your submittal preparation, feel free to contact me if there are further questions or clarification required relative to the instructions, and I'll be more than happy to assist you with that.
Thanks, Bridget. I think at least one of the things we have proprietary information.
Right.
I think the section is up here.
It's on the redacted.
Yeah. As I mentioned earlier, you can mark certain things as proprietary, but you should make sure that you understand under Virginia law which things are actually proprietary. Pricing is never proprietary. Right. Your whole proposal is not proprietary, but you are able to, based on your understanding of statute, mark certain things that way and redact it. I can't remember where this section is. Oh, J, 2J.
Section J, yeah, proprietary.
Okay. Okay. So why don't we look at a couple of the other documents. Exhibit 2.1 is a pretty important one. That's really our core requirements for all of the services. This document we marked as a template because it allows you to respond here with instructions that are provided up at the beginning. And essentially we've got, I don't know, somewhere around 100 pages of requirements that each is formatted in this box. So, you know, the box allows you to indicate, or the table allows you to indicate yes or no that you can comply with a particular requirement. It allows you to put a response next to it in the right. We're definitely saying if you say no, you should explain why it's no, why you can't meet that, or if you could meet it with some change, then you should indicate there. There's a broad description of our goals, some of which is repeated from the RFP instructions here, and so you can read that and make sure that you understand it, or keep that in mind as you're responding to the rest of the proposal. You can see that we've covered the various, you know, sort of all the scope of services that is involved in this RFP, from, you know, server to storage, directory services to facilities to enhanced and future services, you know, all within this document. As I think Bridget mentioned at the beginning, we're not able to answer really technical questions or scope questions on this call, but if you do have any questions about it, of course, we would expect you to submit those to Bridget, and we'll respond in writing. Exhibit 2.2 is formatted just like Exhibit 2.1, but it is the requirements that relate to the cross-functional services, you know, that you would use to integrate with the MSI. So SAIC, or really the MSI RFP, when it was released, had an Exhibit 2.1 that was MSI requirements. And each of the tower suppliers gets an Exhibit 2.2 that, from kind of a table of contents perspective, is the same as the MSI's document, but it describes the sort of integration relationship that you have. So whereas the MSI 2.1 might have a requirement to provide a certain tool, the Exhibit 2.2 that a tower supplier has might, in the same section, say integrate with a certain tool that the MSI is providing. So you can see the kinds of things, and the MSI framework being really based around ITIL. You can see that the various components here are represented. So then we have two solution templates that allow you to respond to Exhibit 2.1 and 2.2 respectively. And so those documents are Exhibit 2.3.1, which has a table of contents that is the same as your 2.1, but it is otherwise basically an empty template for you to describe your solution. And, you know, this allows you to provide, you know, full narrative and, you know, broad description of your solution with any necessary charts and that sort of thing, but allows us to see that it's aligned with the requirements in 2.1, and we can sort of cross-check. And again, there is a solution template 2.3.2 that is your solution response to Exhibit 2.2. Again, formatted kind of the same way. We've also got Exhibit 2.4, which is the implementation plan template. The implementation plan would be presented by you really in two components. The first is this Word document that I think of as more like a project charter that you know, describes your overall approach, your overall timeline, approach to risk mitigation, and that sort of thing. So again, a template here where you can provide all of that information. And then 2.4.1 is an Excel file which allows you to present your implementation milestones. And the implementation milestones, you know, we know that behind the scenes you may have a detailed, you know, 1,000-row project plan or something, but that's perhaps too much to absorb in initial phases and probably too much for the contract. And so we like to see a grid of the key milestones, you know, let's say 40 or 50, that describe your implementation, and maybe that would come in several parts. Maybe it's sort of a taking over the environment. Maybe it's secondarily a documentation, and then third, perhaps a move to a new environment. I'm not proposing you do that necessarily. I'm just saying that you can divide it up in whatever stages or categories that you think are appropriate. We've also presented a site list, which kind of for informational purposes has some volumes. I want to point out that you know, these volumes are not perfectly accurate, and we've also redacted some sites for security reasons, but they should just give you a high-level view of what our profile of sites looks like. And then you can submit back in this form, you know, indicate what facilities you might provide services from. So that's the list of documents we've released under the Exhibit 2 suite. So next I'll open Exhibit 3, which is reporting and service level management. And as I said in the overview, this document, this Word document, describes the methodology for quality management really for this whole program. Part of the example that I use when I'm talking about the need for consistency across some of these documents is the definition of a severity level, which is one of the things represented here in Exhibit 3. So of course it would not make sense in a multi-supplier ecosystem for each supplier to have a different definition of a severity level 2. And so we define that, and we ask, you know, each supplier to have that same definition of severity level 2. So by extension, you know, the processes around tracking, the definitions of shared and related metrics, the processes around earn back, continuous improvement, all these various concepts that I think many of you are used to, you know, are intended to be the same across providers. So again, you can respond to this and give us your feedback. Perhaps you've got a better idea on something, and that's fine. Excuse me. But ultimately, we expect all suppliers to kind of comply with the service level methodology. So the next form we've released is the service level matrix, Exhibit 3.1. I'm sure many of you are used to this form, but I think what's perhaps somewhat unique in this process is we're asking you to propose back any of your tower-specific metrics. And you can, of course, add rows if you like. And then off to the right, we've got and of course you can extend this, but it's just to give us a brief overview. So, you know, if you decide that, you know, there's a gold server availability and the target is X%, you know, how does that work? Maybe you describe your algorithm a little bit. And this is just meant to be a much simplified or summary version of what you would ordinarily see in our Exhibit 3.2, which has, you know, we'll one day have, you know, detailed description of the inclusions, exclusions, the algorithm, the measuring tools, etc. We just want a brief overview of it here so we understand it. And later in the process, we'll refine it. As I mentioned earlier, we do have some metrics in here that are those metrics that the MSI has agreed to and that we expect you to share with them. There are 3 types of service levels that we describe, and you'll see them in Exhibit 3. Unique, which are unique to any one provider. So a server provider may have a backup quality metric of some kind, perhaps, that really the MSI would not have any particular influence on. And so that might be unique to you. Likewise, the MSI has some unique metrics that relate to service desk performance. But some of these metrics are related. We define them as R for related, and that means to us things like incident resolution, where you will be measured on all incidents in the server environment, but the MSI will be measured on all incidents in the server environment, security environment, EUS environment, etc. And so they really have an enterprise, you know, a pool of incidents where you have the tower specific. Then finally, there will be some that are marked as S, which means shared or fully shared, and those will be some of your metrics that initially would look like tower-specific ones, so perhaps server availability. But of course, the MSI operating the service desk and helping write our enterprise processes and operating all the agreements has some shared accountability ultimately for server availability. And so we would nominate perhaps some of your availability metrics as being shared with the MSI. And likewise, we'll do that with other tower suppliers. We've also released our reports matrix. This is a long list of reports, the likes of which I think you've seen before. But we point them out as the kinds of things that we expect, but we recognize that during the solution with you and then in implementation beyond, we'll actually determine which reports are available directly in your systems on an ad hoc basis, or which might actually need to be delivered in a binder every month to our service lead. So this gives you a view of that. It's organized into some cross-functional reports and administrative reports, and then some tower-specific reports. So now we'd like to get into Exhibit 4, and I'll hand it off to my colleague, Alejandro. Alejandro, would you like to introduce yourself, and then we'll pick up Exhibit 4.
Certainly. Good morning, everyone. My name is Alejandro Gondra. I'm with Integris Finance, and we just want to walk you through some of the financial documents as part of the Exhibit 4.0 suite. Before we walk through the documents, I just wanted to give a pretty high-level summary of kind of how we've structured the pricing structure in this RFP. It's a little bit different than the ones that we've put out here in the last year or so. We wanted to separate really the pricing into three major categories. Of course, we have the milestone charge type pricing methodology, in which we have a discrete deliverable and we pay a one-time amount. And that's meant to cover your implementation efforts and the initial acquisition of VITA's existing assets used to provide the services that are in place today. Then we've got an HSE, or hardware service charge methodology, in which suppliers will recover their cost for agency-specific hardware. If a specific agency turns on a server, maybe a gold instance, then that's how they would, the suppliers would recover the hardware cost for that. And then everything else, steady state labor, infrastructure, hardware for net new items that aren't part of the existing environment, or software would be recovered in what we're calling the monthly unit rates. And one of the things that I just want to point out is that VITA is seeking to have primarily, if not exclusively, purely consumption-based monthly unit rates, or in other words, 100% variable. But we do recognize the fact that suppliers have other fixed costs to recover, and so we invite in the instructions in Exhibit 4.0 for suppliers to propose how those fixed costs would be recovered, and we want to make this a collaborative effort to come up with a pricing structure that works not only for VITA, but for the supplier to get kind of the ultimate structure. And what we've done is we've briefly laid out the structure in the instructions, and we want to work out the details with supplier input. So having said that, I think right now what's on the screen is Exhibit 4.0, and it touches on what the different pricing methodologies are within this exhibit: the milestone pricing methodology, the monthly unit rate methodology, the instructions that I alluded to, and it also just briefly touches base on how inflation is covered within this agreement. Some of the chargeback methodology, the fact that you're going to have to provide some billing information to the MSI so that we can ultimately bill back our agencies, or VITA can bill back their agencies, things of that nature. The format of 4.0 is a table format, so your response to any exceptions that you might have within the terms, the financial terms within Exhibit 4.0, can be made in this table at the beginning of the document. Then we've got an introduction, and then we've got kind of the full suite of financial exhibits here. In 4.1, we have our pricing metric. We'll open that up and probably spend the most amount of time reviewing that. We've got our Exhibit 4.2, the resource unit definitions. In that particular exhibit, we provide a format for you to describe what each of the resource units will contain, and then we'll work together to come up with a final resource unit definition based on, of course, your solution and your proposal. Exhibit 4.3 is the financial responsibilities matrix. That's something that's going to be developed later. Again, it's something that we hope to collaborate with suppliers on. We've not released that as part of the initial RFP. Some of the key things that are often contained in the FRM are software currency and hardware refresh cycles. So to give suppliers an idea of what's expected, we've included some of that language in the MSA. So please reference that language to guide your solution. Of course, we've included a form of invoice. This is just the format that we're sharing with all suppliers that we expect to see the invoice in. The base case, these are forward-looking numbers, and ultimately what we expect to fall within as part of these server storage pricing proposals. And as Tim said earlier, we've got exhibits 4.6 and 4.7 in which we share our current environment, infrastructure software, agency hardware, and infrastructure hardware. So those two are, I forget what the response format is.
We marked template because there's certain things for them to respond to.
That's right.
Right.
So those are two template exhibits, and what we expect there is for suppliers to go through it and understand whether or not those particular items will be used as part of your solution. So there's detailed instructions within each of those exhibits to allow suppliers to communicate how they plan to use the assets that are currently available. And I think there's one more exhibit there listed, and that's exhibit 4.9 billing triggers document. That's something that'll be developed later, as well as exhibit 4.8 third-party contracts. Once we have that information available to share with suppliers, we'll give you the information related to the current third-party contracts that are in place for hardware maintenance, software maintenance, things of that nature. And I think we can move to 4.1. So exhibit 4.1, again, this is slightly different than the 4.1s that we've released as part of our other RFPs. And again, we're laying out the structure of how we want the pricing to function, and we want to work together with the supplier to work out the details. There are two instruction tabs in this exhibit. The first is just a general overview of what the pricing should look like. We want the pricing to be separate for the different sub-towers, just so that we can understand what the, for example, data center management services cost as a standalone. So be sure to pay attention to this tab to understand what we want priced where, so that we can very cleanly understand what the cost of those services are. And then, of course, below this is just general instructions on inflation. That should be managed as defined in Exhibit 4.0, which is essentially tied to an actual inflation index, and it escalates every year throughout the contract. And then further down below, we've got instructions on how to fill out each of the individual tabs. If you move over to the pricing structure instructions, this just says what we're looking for in the detailed pricing structure. Again, we said we want implementation charges billed via milestones, we want to build via HSC, and we want everything else billed via monthly rates. And we're hoping that the detailed RU proposals that suppliers come in with maintain these goals. We want them to be predictable, manageable, an effective cost proxy. Of course, we want to reflect the supplier's costs as well as possible, so that, of course, we're both benefiting from this relationship. We want to make sure that the RU structure that you propose posits the right incentives in the environment, so that behavior is accurately encouraged, and we want everything to be flexible. So again, we're expecting these to be as flexible as possible, potentially 100% variable, but we understand the need for other fixed costs, primarily that of new infrastructure, to be recovered. So again, in the 4.0 instructions, we include a statement that invites suppliers to propose how they want to recover those particular fixed costs. Okay. If you move over to the first tab, total estimated charges, this is really going to be the P times Q, your monthly rates multiplied times the volumes that are consumed in the environment today. And then this is just for us to understand the total cost of steady state services or run services for this proposal. So this is just a summary. Tab 1A has the same cost, but a different view. We have it segmented by cost type. And so that just gives us further visibility into your solution so that we can understand it and work together to improve it. You can move over to the third tab, I believe, there, Tim. Monthly unit rates. So this is the tab in which we invite you to propose the actual detailed RUs. Again, we've got a structure, a high-level structure in place, but we want to have input from the supplier community as part of this RFP to see what would be the best form to consume some of these services in. Your solution might dictate a certain set of RUs, and we invite you to propose those, and we will evaluate them and see what we want to move forward with at a later stage. Tab 3 would ordinarily contain our current volumes in the environment today, but since we're not dictating the detailed RU set, we've left this blank. As the suppliers propose their RU set in this Exhibit 4.1, you can fill out each of these resource units rows, propose the volume that you think would be consumed there, and the source for these volumes will be Exhibit 4.1.1. That is a snapshot of what our environment looks like today, what the billable resource units that are consumed look like in the current environment. And so that'll be the basis for the building of your proposal, or it should be the basis for the building of your proposal and for the building of these proposed RU sets and the estimated volumes for those. Finally, we've got this HSC tab. Again, HSC will be the mechanism, and this is described in 4.2 in detail, in Exhibit 4.2, but it'll be the mechanism via which agencies pay for or suppliers recover the cost of agency-specific hardware. And we just want some further detail as to what your HSC plan is in your solution. To Tim's point earlier, we released Exhibit 4.6 and 4.7 that has some hardware information. So to the degree that there's additional information that's needed to refine this, we'll look at providing that along the process, but we provided as much as we can today in those exhibits to help you understand the age of the assets and details thereof. And this is just a summary view of how you're expecting to refresh those agency-owned assets throughout the term of this contract. All right, we can skip to the milestone charges tab. We've got some milestone charges here. Your implementation plan will, of course, have different sets of milestones. We ask that you pick and choose the different milestones that should be a payment milestone, and we'll work together to make sure that that aligns with not only the supplier goals, but VITA goals. And so a subset of all of the implementation milestones will be payment milestones and should be populated here. I think that is largely it. So one of the things that we included here is an estimated asset purchase price for the existing assets related to each of these towers. Some of these are based on the contractual asset acquisition fees that are included in the CIA or our current contract with the incumbent. And so we expect these to be payment milestones that would be recovered over the term of the agreement and be used in the provision of the services within your proposal. So we ask that you try to leverage those as you see fit.
Yeah, sort of in summary, there's a need for incoming suppliers to cover the fees and take on the assets of the incumbent supplier, and we want to do that in the form of a milestone payment. But of course, we anticipate the milestone charges would be amortized over the term. So So that number is the estimate of what that would be. It would then be amortized as any other implementation milestone charge would be. Sure.
All right, tab 6A is the milestone implementation tab. It's the implementation milestones, but again with a slightly different view by cost type, by tower, and the dollars that are provided here by the supplier should be on a cash basis, just so we understand when there will be heavy cash outlays in supplier solutions so that we can work together to ensure that the pricing works not only for VITA but for the supplier. I think you can skip to the termination tab. Here we'd like you to fill in the termination caps. The termination methodology is spelled out in Exhibit 4.0. We've got essentially different categories of termination fees, unrecovered implementation charges, employee severance, supplier equipment, and third-party contracts. The language in Exhibit 4.0 explains the mechanism via which the actual termination cost that the supplier incurs are calculated and recovered for. And this sheet allows the supplier to put in a cap. And we do need a cap so that we can evaluate what the ultimate impact would be. But again, this is a table that the supplier should provide a cap for each of these categories, and then the calculation of the actual termination cost is spelled out in Exhibit 4.0. And then finally, we've got inflation sensitivity tab. Again, the monthly unit rate should not include inflation, so any of the pricing should not account for inflation. That will be handled as described in Exhibit 4.0, and it will be, each RU will essentially be tied to the inflation index as provided by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and will increase as inflation increases every year. And we just ask that the suppliers provide by RU the percentage of the charges each of those RUs that are sensitive to inflation. And finally, we've got a rate card here to the degree that we consume project services, or solution services rather, and we have FTEs that are billed at an hourly rate. The different types of sources available under this contract should be listed here, and their applicable hourly rates. I think that's it for 4.1.
Which do you want to open next? Do you want to be all done there?
Yeah, 4.
Well, let's go to 4.11, which, as I mentioned earlier, is the current consumption. It's really sort of a reference document, right?
Yeah, this is a reference document. So this has our current RU set, the Commonwealth's current RU set as part of our contract with the incumbent, and our consumption. These are the volumes that we use to forecast internally for budgeting purposes and things of that nature. So it's our best guess as to what or not our best guess, it's our best estimate as to what we're consuming today under our current contract and our current RU structure. And so these should be the volumes that, the billable volumes that should be the basis for the supplier solution and pricing. Yeah, if you look over to 4.2. All right, 4.2 is our resource unit definition documents. If you scroll down a little bit, Tim, you'll see that we've got a template and an actual RU definition finalized, if you will, included in this. So again, we start off by saying that we want our RU set to be predictable, manageable, reflect the supplier's costs appropriately, provide the right incentives, and overall be flexible. If you scroll down to section 2, you'll see that for the server and storage resource unit definitions, we've got hardware service charge. Again, this is the mechanism via which the supplier will recover their agency-specific hardware costs, and it's described in detail here. So this is an example of a complex but a finalized, in our mind, resource unit definition. And if you scroll down to the blue section of this document, you'll see that we also provide a template for you to provide your input on the resource units that the supplier proposes. We want to make sure that we understand how it's counted, what tool counts it, when it's counted, and what's included in that particular RU. So we've got a series of yes or no questions here that the supplier should answer, and if there's anything that's been left out in the standard format, we do invite the supplier to add any other specifics that'll help us understand what's included in that resource unit for the purposes of pricing.
Core 6, maybe? Core 6.
The next exhibit that we'll review is Exhibit 4.6. And this includes the current environment as we have it in the CMD today. It's segmented by tower. If you look at each of the tabs within this document, you'll see that we have a server environment tab, a storage tab, a facilities tab, a network tab, so on and so forth. We've not only shared what the server, storage, data center environment looks like, but we've shared what the overall environment looks like today. And if you look within each of these tabs, for example, the server environment tab, you'll see that we have the details of not only the agency servers, but of the infrastructure servers as well. We've tried to identify that as best as possible here and laid it out in a format that's easily understandable, but of course there will still be questions that you'll have, and we'll try to work to get additional information where possible throughout the course of this RFP, mainly in the due diligence phase.
And Alejandro, we are receiving some questions through the tool. You're welcome, by the way, to submit questions anytime. For the most part, we'll answer at the end. But there was a question about, what can you share about the status of current assets, age and, where they are in their life cycle or whatever. I think this is the best representation that we have.
That's right.
So if you have a specific question as you look through the data, certainly feel free to ask, via Bridget over email, and we'll try and respond. But in general, this is the best view of the data that we have. So on a related note, we've not released the financial responsibilities matrix, which normally would have things like a refresh cycle, say, servers every 4 years or whatever. So do we have a view on that?
Yeah, we do. And suppliers should look at the MSA. We've got some content there. Software should be N-1, and of course the refresh cycle is spelled out in the MSA generally, so we can have a guidepost for suppliers to price to.
Yeah, and we recognize that there will be a difference between your taking on the environment and then you're refreshing and evolving the environment, right? So, you'll take a look at our requirements and, of course, put together a proposal that you think is the most pragmatic to get us where we need to be in sort of a steady state operating environment and then a future environment. Alejandro, probably talk a little further about the fact that you have included all, records related to all of these other towers as well. And part of the reason is for reference, right? So that suppliers can see what else is out there. But also because I think in the response area way up to the right, maybe you can tell them how to use.
So all of the items in Section 1 are existing details on the equipment in the CMDB. Section 2 of each of these tabs is geared more towards supplier response. In the tower column, you'll see that VITA's taken an initial pass and try to categorize each of these items into the tower that we believe that particular asset will belong in our future platform. So, for example, the majority of these in the server tower you should see tagged as server. But one of the things that we're hoping to accomplish is ensuring that we understand what will be needed not only for your solution, but as part of the server scope and what will be tied to the actual payment that we make to our incumbent supplier as part of our termination fees and our acquisition of existing assets. So what we're asking suppliers to do is to tell us as much about how they plan to use the asset by filling out these columns, and telling us whether or not they think it's in scope. So for example, there could be a set of infrastructure servers that suppliers know to be in scope and they're tagged as server, but that won't be used for the supplier solution. And so those would be things that are in scope but not used in the solution, and supplier would mark an X under that column. If you will be using those for your solution, you would mark an X under the first column, equipment is in scope, then used in solution. And if we've overlooked something or tagged something incorrectly, or you just want to have further discussion on something, there's other fields that you can opine on. So for example, you can say that the equipment is not in scope and will not be used, and if we've tagged that incorrectly, we'll understand that that's not an asset that you're counting on, and that'll allow us to reconcile not only in this effort, but in efforts across some of our other procurements. And finally, we've got a column there that says new equipment. If you're bringing in new equipment, we ask that you list it at the bottom of each of these tables, and just explain a little bit of how those pieces of equipment are being used in your solution.
Software.
The same is true for software. We've got a tab that identifies what we believe is software relevant to server, storage, and data center. And so we're asking suppliers to, first of all, look at the detail we've provided for each of these items of software. Now, we have redacted some of the things that are a bit more sensitive. We've provided as much detail as we have available to us and that we can share. If you move over to the right, you'll have a similar response section in which suppliers can tell us how they plan to use this or not, these pieces of software, these software items in their solution. Now the second tab has a list of software assets for all other towers, again allowing full visibility into, or as much visibility as we have today, into the software being used in other towers. Now one of the things that we're doing is we're moving from one supplier to a multi-supplier model and platform, and of course there could be certain software items that are used today by our incumbents that could apply to multiple towers for inventory purposes or things of that nature. So we're just allowing this full buyers to see if there's any interest in what we think belongs in another tower, again, just so we can the assets that are being used as part of your solution. And finally, we've got the software assets that are currently in place or will be in place for our MSI solution. These are also available in the SAIC contract that we've alluded to being posted in the VITA website, but it just provides a little bit more detail as to what types of tools the MSI is going to put in place and will need to be integrated into.
Okay, that's probably it for the finance.
Yep.
Any other summary? Okay. So there is one more document, and that is Exhibit 5.2, which is the personnel projection matrix. Whoops. Through here. This allows you to indicate your FTEs involved in delivering the services. So sort of a total count by month, starting in year -1, which obviously is intended to reflect the implementation effort. And then, it's categorized by some of the cross-functional related areas, really a summary of the Exhibit 2.2 sections. Account overhead, so some of the more like behind-the-scenes folks, and then your delivery-specific people in various categories that this relates to the table of contents from Exhibit 2.1. The tab I'm showing you is a total tab, and in fact, you should not populate this tab directly. It summarizes what's in the Run tab and then the Implementation tab. So that just allows us to get a little more clarity of, how the volumes change during, or which individuals are devoted only to implementation versus Run. So that covers the list of documents. And so we'll kind of move toward our closing and opening for questions. And as I'm doing that, you can submit questions via this tool, and I want to encourage you to do that. I think it generally found that that's an easier way rather than trying to open the lines, which creates oftentimes other communication challenges. As much as we might like to talk to you verbally, this will probably work better. So I want to encourage you to inquire about the environment overview documents. Really, that means email Bridget and ask for those documents. We didn't post those in the RFP. Partly, I know some are wondering why not just make those available online. Well, there's just a lot of narrative about our current environment that is certainly available in public record requests, but they're sort of available and Googleable. So we decided to, just make those available on request. And of course, from time to time, we may also update those. And it's not really a formal RFP amendment, it's just more information that we might release as part of the Q&A phase. I also, we've said many times, I want to encourage you to read the SAIC contract, and I think really any of VITA's contracts on its website, vita.virginia.gov. But this is a link directly to it, a short URL to get you right there. And of course, contact Bridget anytime. Email is really the preferred method because we want to track communication and make sure that we get all the right answers in place. We are going to be posting answers. We're going to aim for about twice a week to post responses. Some questions we may be able to respond to almost immediately. Others we're going to need to do some research internally. This presentation will also be posted on EVA, the presentation itself. We will also, again, assuming there's no technical issue, we will post a video to YouTube, and the link will be on EVA. And then we will also post the list of attendees, supplier attendees. Yeah. So as we're getting ready to respond to questions, as I mentioned before, we're not really equipped amongst this group here to answer solution-related questions, but we will, so mostly we're looking for process questions. In general, we will, for many of these questions that are answered here today, we will try and include those in our Q&A so that you can see a written record on some of them as well. So let me start with some of the questions that we're receiving. And again, please encourage you to send questions along here. So does the software list include the messaging towers, even though it's not been implemented yet? So Alejandro, can you speak to that? Do we have messaging-related software within the Exhibit 4.7?
Yeah, the existing 4.7 is information from our existing CMDB, and it's got information related to our existing solution. We've not implemented that. So the infrastructure and equipment that are reflected in Exhibit 4.6 are part of our current solution, not our Google Tempest Nova provided solution.
Is the intent to take on the current building lease for the data center to buy the building, or is it based on individual response? Well, it's based on the individual response ultimately. You can see, and I think we spoke to this a little bit in the Data Center Environment Overview document. The CIA, is probably, you're all aware, we have two facilities, a primary and a secondary facility that provide server services for VITA. Sept, which is also where VITA's offices are, and that's the primary data center. And then in Southwest Virginia, there is one we call SWEPS, which is the backup and disaster recovery center. The VITA's rights to those facilities differ within the CIA. And we want to encourage you to take a look at the CIA, to try and understand VITA's rights to those, and think about your solution, whether it would be to take on the facility in some fashion, move us to another facility at some point in time, and feel free to ask solution-related questions. Is the plan to award one provider for all sub-towers, or will each sub-tower be awarded individually? VITA's intent is to identify a single supplier, for all of the services covered in this RFP. Of course, VITA always has the right to selectively award or to award to multiple providers, but it is the intent for for to identify one supplier for this particular scope of services. Will VITA remain in the facility if someone were to take over the lease or buy the building? Again, VITA is, another way to say it is somewhat agnostic at this point on the facility. They don't necessarily care to be in the facility owning business. And so really, we're looking to providers to propose their own solution. And if that includes, VITA staying there in that space, that's fine. If not, then VITA will account for that component of its business case using other DES provided space. Are the services within this contract set forth in this RFP extendable to other VITA eligible municipalities and agencies? So a little bit of a nuanced answer there. Some of our agreements, if you look, for example, at messaging, or some other ones that VITA, has awarded through other procurements, they are available both to VITA and to other public bodies. The security one was structured that way as well. So in other words, any other public body, say a county or a local police force, or in some cases even other states, can buy off VITA's contract by executing their own statement of work with that supplier. But that's not all contracts. Not all contracts are structured to work that way. So the MSI, the mainframe, and this one are intended to be VITA as the customer, really. And then, and if other public bodies would like to use this contract, the default approach would be for them to buy that service through VITA as part of this multi-supplier ecosystem. So in other words, we do not anticipate direct statements of work with municipalities under this agreement. Just pausing for a minute to see if there's any more questions. Okay, so a couple of other process-related questions have come through. Some timing questions about our posting. When will this go on YouTube? Well, as soon as possible, but not today. It'll take us a little bit of time to download and encode it, assuming it works, and then get it posted. I expect, within probably 2 days. The presentation itself, I think we'll be able to post today. Just a flat, kind of PDF of this PowerPoint. There was a question earlier about, can you clarify what's provided versus what, I think what RFP documents are being provided or will be part of the RFP eventually versus what was on the web. That question came in very early, and so maybe I've answered it. But, in summary, the table of contents, the RFP table of documents, indicates which files have been made available now and which files would be available later, and which files are available by request from Bridget. Okay, I'm pausing a little bit longer to see if there's any more questions while we're waiting. Again, EVA is the central point of information regarding this. So we will not be communicating. Certainly VITA communicates news and other things on its website, but anything related to this procurement, whether it's these presentations posted, the current documents, other documents that may come in an amendment, answers to the questions submitted, all of that will be on the EVA page. Okay, it looks like we've got a question again about is VITA putting together a bidders library? No, not other than EVA. That's our communication vehicle. And again, as I mentioned, there's just some documents we chose not to post on EVA, but they're available. In a sense, EVA is the library of all documents related to procurement. Okay, not seeing any more questions. Bridget, would you like to begin any closing remarks?
Well, in closing, I just would like to remind all potential bidders to please remember to check EVA frequently. That is the tool that we'll be using to post questions and answers real time. And as Tim mentioned earlier, it is our intent to post questions and answers documents to EVA at least twice a week. Also, amendments, if applicable, will be posted there as well. So it is really important that you check the EVA website at least once a week to make sure you're updated with all of the most current information. So other than that, that concludes our session for today. We again would like to thank you all for joining in, and we look forward to communicating with you throughout the remainder of the process. Thank you.